All right, happy Monday.
Happy Monday. How's it going?
Good, good. So this week we want to talk about something that we see, I think, on a near weekly basis. The discussion
Yeah,
is, should I learn R or should I learn Python?
yeah. And it tends to get a bit contentious too. People are highly, highly opinionated about this. And I think our approach is fairly even-handed. I think we've interacted with both and we have pretty positive opinions of both.
Yeah, exactly. So let's kick it off. Let's look
Yeah.
at some of the noise out there. So
Lots of noise, lots of
yeah,
signal to start to differentiate. Yep.
it's a lot. I mean, the term R versus Python, I mean, returns 372 million results in Google, which is kind of astounding. And I would
Yep.
say for every article that is published like this, there's an array of opinions. I used to buy into the language wars back in the day. I think we'll get more into why maybe a more holistic opinion or approach might be wiser. But let's
Yeah.
look at some of these results. I mean, R versus Python. Another way to frame it is what are the most popular programming languages out there right now? Um, and there's no shortage of, I guess, opinions, indexes, and results on this. The most, I think, one of the more popular indexes is I think it's pronounced TIOBE or TOB. I don't know.
That's how I pronounce it. Yeah, one of those
Right.
two ways seems
So,
reasonable.
for 2021, January headline, Python is, the TIOBE's programming language of 2020. So, congratulations, Python. You're going
I
places.
thought it was just blown up over the last decade. If you look at it, if you scroll down to the long-term history, it's actually pretty crazy to look at. It's down there a ways, but they show
Yeah.
like every 5 years where the language was with an average. So yeah,
Hmm.
now look at this. I mean, it's crazy. Like since 2002.
Yeah. Yeah. For those trying to figure that out, that's the green line that we're showing.
Yeah,
R in the meantime, I mean, it's not been as popular as Python. I think we can get into maybe some reasons why in a bit.
but in
But
2020, it's gotten a huge boost, right? Like it kind of was declining to the beginning of 2020, and then it's doubled since then, back up to nearly 2% mind
mhm.
share.
Yeah, right. And there's some
So,
speculation. I mean, there's
yeah, yeah,
like,
that's
is R gaining popularity because of COVID-19? Maybe people are
yep,
doing more analysis on it. It's kind of funny. Hadley Wickham actually has a tweet,
yep.
a bit skeptical of Tyobe's uh, index in general.
Right.
You know,
And I mean, if you're in physics and you're doing laboratory experiments, which I used to do a long time back in the day, a long time ago, you always try to calculate your signal to noise ratio, right? Well, I don't know what your methodology here would be to calculate signal versus noise. Not to mention that each index is kind of sampling different things and
hmm
set different.
Stack Overflow has their own developer survey here,
Yeah,
right? So, but this is more general purpose programming languages too, like TypeScripts, obviously
exactly.
in there, and it measures things like uh, most loved technology, right? So it
Yeah,
may not be like the most popular, but I would say, there's other metrics to look at. And then also there's this article top towards data science, top programming languages for data science in 2020, right? So if we
yeah.
go down this list, Python, clearly number one, then JavaScript, I
Yeah,
suppose. That's what
it's
makes
it's a
sense.
huge language. We just in the data world, it's becoming popular for certain things, right? It shows up when you're doing user-defined functions like Snowflake and BigQuery, for example, but we don't tend to interact with it that much day to day
Right, like
ourselves.
TensorFlow JS, that kind of stuff. And
Mhm. Yeah,
yeah, you have Java. I mean, that one's we talk about that in a bit. R, clearly it's a data language. C and C++, SQL, definitely a data language. MATLAB, yeah,
still big. I
still
mean,
big.
yeah,
Scala.
especially in
So
industry, academia. Yep.
Julia, we'll talk more about Julia in a bit.
Yeah,
I consider that sort of the dark horse. SAS. So I'll stop sharing. But point
yeah.
being, there's no shortage of opinions out there and indexes and obviously articles about R
Right,
versus Python and other languages. So
right. How did you come to Python again? I can tell you my story in a bit, but yeah, how did you come into it for web app development or data originally?
I think it was kind of a mix of both, actually.
Okay.
So I was doing, I think it was 2009. I was doing MIT's OpenCourseware.
Yeah.
They had a Python class on there. And I was like, oh yeah, this language is pretty cool. So and then early on, I was doing, you know, I think like data pre-processing for ML, and then obviously I worked as a software engineer doing web apps as well, kind of more data-driven web apps. And Python easily worked in all those scenarios. So how about
Yeah,
yourself?
absolutely. It's funny for me, I actually came to Python through academia. So, as a graduate student at the University of Utah, I helped to run these summer programs for high school students, and they were built around, basic number theory. And we would have them program all of the number theory, like Sieve Veritasi's, where you find a list of prime numbers using Python because it's a very good number language for handling integers. Like, there's just nothing to think about. You don't have to think about overflows. It naturally handles integers of almost arbitrary size. And so you could have these students just hacking together number theory code very quickly.
That's
So
cool.
then I got into the data side of it later, of course, when I got into data science after graduating. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. And so yeah, I think to circle back to the question, should you
yeah.
choose R or Python? Maybe we can go through quickly, the pros and cons of each language, and then give our opinions
Yeah.
on that. What are some of the pros of R?
So I think, R is just a fantastic statistical language. And from what I've seen, this is a bit anecdotal, but part of the reason for the massive growth of R in the last like 2 decades is that it's really started to replace things like SAS. Now, SAS is still important, but it's also very expensive. And companies tend to use it if they need a language that's regulated and completely compatible. So if you're in the insurance industry, you might use SAS because there are certain guarantees that the API and the calculations are not going to change. And R doesn't give you those same kinds of guarantees. But like, I know if I remember correctly, the University of Utah for teaching statistics switched from SAS to R sometime in the early 2000s. And that's not an uncommon trend. It's just such a great statistical language that if you don't need those guarantees and you don't want to pay for a very expensive license, then R is just your natural go-to. For statistics, in my opinion, it's easier than Python because it's designed to do one thing extremely well, whereas
Yeah.
Python is designed to do everything.
Yeah, I definitely found Python's libraries, statistical libraries, are lagging behind R's.
Yeah.
Um, Let's see, what are some of the other pros of R? I would think that the community in R's pretty nice.
Yeah.
I have noticed that. I mean, I've done both R and Python in production. I think that R's got a fantastic and supportive community. There's a lot of libraries,
And it's focused,
data
right?
focused libraries. What's that?
Mhm. Well, exactly what you said. It's focused on one thing. And
Mhm.
so with Python, like someone develops a library or something in the core is going to be designed to serve 10 different needs. It's going to be designed to serve every type of developer. Whereas
Mhm.
with R, there's really one core problem that the community is focused on, and that's statistics and more broadly data science and analytics.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I've always used R as sort of a hand calculator, right? So it's if you need to fire up, R and just do quick like t-test or something, it's way, 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 way easier to do it in that than Python by a long
Yeah.
shot, right? R Studio
Yep.
is pretty dang cool. By the
Yeah.
way, R Studio also now works with Python, so there's also that.
Yeah.
But some of the cons of R, I would say, is it's the syntax can be a bit funky. I think the arrow notation throws people off when they first try to use it because they're like,
Yeah.
why are you making an arrow? It's kind of weird. Why not just use an equal sign like a normal person? And then also, indexes starting at one. That's
Yeah.
it takes a bit of getting used to. But if you've been programming a while, it's like these are things that you should overcome in about the first like 2 seconds of using the language.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
that's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
I would say if you're starting out, just understand there are differences between R and Python,
Yeah.
such as the
Absolutely.
use of arrows and um, you know one base indexes versus zero base indexes. The other cons might be it's R has a reputation as being a productive language for analysis. It
Yeah.
also has a reputation as being not performant in production.
Yeah. And that partially depends on parallelism, which we'll loop back to when we talk about the disadvantages of Python.
Yeah, but I think it depends on your use case, right? Like
Yep.
it's,
Absolutely.
what does production mean to you? Everyone's production is different. And so, are you going to run Google on R? No, probably not.
It'd be
So,
insane. I
right.
mean, the other thing is that I can't build an API with R very easily. I guess you can do that these days, but it's just much more natural with Python. And so if I'm trying to serve a model, so I can develop the model on my laptop, use Python, and then Python can serve it as well. It's very straightforward to build a web server with Python, basically.
Mhm. Yeah. So, different, there's pros and cons. I think the other argument is it's arguably slower than Python. But again, I would look at it from the lens of like, what are you trying to do and what do you need?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because if you take the slowness argument to its extreme, you would never use Python either. So,
Yeah, just
right,
use C, right? Code
right,
everything in
or
C.
yeah, or Rust or whatever. It's like
Right.
you're not going to even mess around with something like Python or R. So let's talk about some of the advantages of Python.
Yeah. So one thing that's great about Python is that it is a general purpose language. Going back to your story about how you got into it, I mean, you can use it for teaching math students about number theory. You can use it for web app development. You can use it for statistics and data science. It just works across all these different domains. And it's really from the ground up a general purpose object oriented programming language that uses a fairly familiar syntax. There are some quirks with the syntax. You have to worry about indentation, which throws people off at first. But otherwise, it's a lot similar to C and C++ and Java, C Sharp, this kind of whole family of C oriented languages. And so easy to learn if you come from one of those languages, easy to go to an object oriented language if you learn Python first. And you can take it to all kinds of different domains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing that attracted me to Python, it was the fact that everything is it's explicit over implicit, right? Or I say
Yeah,
R is almost the opposite, where it's implicit versus
absolutely.
explicit.
Yeah.
But by being explicit, it makes your code readable. There are standards,
Yep.
through PEP 8 and other standards in Python, and so I think that goes a long ways towards I think making the code just more universally accessible to people. So if you were to look at in GitHub at a project and it's in Python, you stand a much better chance of understanding what's going on because there are implicit coding standards, even through the forced use of indentations, for example. That's something you don't see in a lot of other languages. I would say some other advantages. Python, as the old saying goes, it's the second best language at everything. So you will find pretty much for any problem that you want to solve, you're going to find a library out there that can probably help you solve it.
Right. And then when it comes to deep learning, like TensorFlow, for example, arguably it's the best language, right? And PyTorch as well. Like it's the native language for TensorFlow and PyTorch. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it's the core of those frameworks. Those frameworks are written in things like C and CUDA, GPU languages, but it's the standard API. And in fact, if you go to the TensorFlow documentation, it tells you we support this huge list of languages, but only the Python API is subject to a stability guarantee. All the others could change and break your code with new releases.
Yeah, it's the first class. Yeah, it's the first class language of data right now. I mean, I think inarguably it is. The fact that like Spark was Scala first back in the day, and it's still is a first class citizen. But there's no secret why PySpark is as accessible as like a pip install in Python because
Right.
it's like there's a lot of people using Python.
Yeah.
If you ignore Python, I think you do it at your own peril.
Absolutely.
Said.
Now for Spark, I'd make a counter argument, which I think I've heard from our adherents, which is that Sparkly R is now very mature and a good framework. But still, my general impression is that Python is even more of a first class citizen on Spark.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I would say modern data packages that are coming out. I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
them are written in Python, whereas back in the day they would have been more of a JVM based language. So whether that's Java or most likely Scala, actually, because I think Scala lends itself a lot more to those types of projects. But either way, right? It's and for a long time, I think you had projects like Jython, which tried to mimic Python in the JVM environment, but I don't really see too much about Jython these
Well,
days.
It's funny, actually. In certain areas, it is a first class citizen. It's kind of awkward to use. It's especially awkward to install and maintain dependencies. But like Jython shows up in Airflow, for example, Apache Airflow, because you need to connect with the JDBC driver. So Jython is kind of running behind the scenes there to make that possible. But yeah, it's Jython is very tricky to work with.
Mhm. And I think some other advantages of Python is that you can make it fast. I mean, if you're using NumPy, for
Yep,
example, or SciPy, it drops down to low-level C and works super fast. So I mean, you can
exactly.
certainly do that in R2. I mean, it can, but
See
the fact that you have
Fortran.
libraries like NumPy that are just that a lot of other packages are built on, right? Deep learning packages and machine learning packages and other packages. NumPy is a first-class citizen, so when
Yeah.
you have speed kind of at your disposal. Some of the disadvantages of Python. I mean, straight up, I'm going to say the global interpreter lock is probably the biggest issue that's holding
Yeah.
Python back. And I know there's been lots of talks about the gilectomy, as it's called, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's another one of those things that could generate a huge schism in the community, like we saw with the release of Python 3, right? I suspect people will be fighting over the global interpreter lock for a long time.
And and honestly, we'll see, because I think that opens the door for a lot of other languages to sort of come in and make a dent. I mean, you're seeing Julia do this, right? Where they basically took what was working in a lot of other languages and what wasn't working, and
Yeah.
I think did a really good job with the language. It's still super early days for Julia as compared to Python, which has been around, I think, longer than Java even. And so
Yeah, what, early 90s, basically?
maybe two or something. Don't
Yeah.
quote me on that, but yeah, it's old. Um, so yeah, but it's that's the kind of the quirk on Python. It's just multi-threading is kind of a pain in the ass. That's how it is.
Look,
So
hasn't Travis Oliphant, who's responsible for like the Conda package, said that that's one of his number one priorities is getting rid of the global interpreter lock. So,
well, if
yeah,
he can do it, he'll get a Nobel Prize, I'm sure. So.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
I'd say the disadvantage of Python is also its advantage, right? It's the second best language at everything, but it's not a specialty language. It's not built to excel at any one thing. And so if you needed something that's super performant for systems, I would say go with Rust, right? If you need something with high concurrency for applications, it's probably going to be Go. It's not going to be Python. I know Python they're making some efforts with async and all that kind of stuff, but it's still, it's just, it's, and I've seen some benchmarks that claim like, async was it Fast API, for example. I think it's supposed to be as performant as Go, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Go and Rust is that they were each built to solve a very specific problem. So my understanding is that Rust was built from the ground up for safety. So compiled language with safety, which C does not have, right? That's why you constantly have these, what the Mozilla Foundation was saying, why they developed Rust, that you constantly have these browser issues because of the safety issues with C. And Go, on the other hand, was designed to solve a lot of problems with concurrency from the ground up. And so concurrency is a first class citizen there. Whereas with Python, it still feels kind of tacked on, right? Like async is awesome, but in Go routines are the primitive of the language, and that's everything runs off of Go routines, basically.
I think to loop back to the
Yeah,
question too, which was, should you learn R or Python? I would say, well, we'll get to our answer in a bit, but it's
yeah,
also depending on the type of problem that you're trying to solve, maybe neither actually.
it's true. Yeah.
There are probably better languages out there depending what you're trying to do. Now, to answer the question, what's our take on should you learn R or Python? I think we're of the opinion it depends, but long term, medium term, learn both.
Yeah. And once you have a job, pick the one that's working best for the things you need to do in that job, probably. But like on the side, maybe learn the other just for the sake of diversity to kind of
Mhm.
understand what's out there and what's useful to solve certain problems. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's sort of like using like it's sort of like debating whether or not you should use like a certain type of hammer and not just use different types of hammers, like a ball peen hammer or a sledgehammer or something. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're all different tools, and you should have different tools at your disposal. Like if you're good at R, you're going to do R things, but that's
Yeah.
about it, right? And if you're going to do Python, you're going to do Python things, whatever those are. But knowing different languages, I think, gives you different design patterns and capabilities. So when you do write software, you can borrow ideas from each language. And, it's just kind of the right tool for the right job. That being said, of course, it depends in your day job, like, what language is your team using? Because that's
Yeah.
pretty much going to be the language you're using. Like, I highly doubt you're going to be on a team that is, say they're writing Python. Like, you're going to be the outcast using R because that's what you want to use. Like, I'm pretty sure most teams are going to, require you to start using Python.
Or it's a pretty dysfunctional team, right? Like all these DevOps principles, you want collaboration in code. You want people to be able to fix each other's code and deploy each other's code. If you can't do that, then you have a massive operational bottleneck and you're just going to undermine the mission of that team.
Mm-hmm. Now, some ways to learn these languages. I mean,
Yeah.
what are some suggestions there?
So, back in the day, like I said, I learned Python originally for teaching purposes. And then when I wanted to get a lot better at Python, I used Code Academy. Back then, it was only Python 2. I think they've introduced Python 3 since then. I haven't looked in Code Academy for R. They might have some pretty good resources now. I know that the R community itself puts out a lot of really nice pedagogical resources, including these, exercise sets, almost like you'd have in a math textbook, for example, or a statistics textbook.
Mm-hmm. In Python, I mean, the documentation is really good. I mean, I typically just point people to, they have a getting started section, I think, and it's like, should be sufficient to learn it. Same with R. There's a lot of good documentation and endless articles.
Yep. Yeah, lots of Medium articles, lots of blog posts.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I would say you're learning it in sort of either language in the golden age of learning languages, right? Where like you have everything at your disposal, YouTube videos, countless courses. Shout out to our friend Dave Langer on his R courses. If you want to learn R, I would suggest looking at those. And then learning Python, it's just there's no shortage of articles. I would almost say there's too many, and that's sort of the problem, right?
Yeah.
There's too much noise out there about R versus Python, so it's almost hard to know where to start and how to get started. My take is I always try and start from first principles, which means reading the documentation and then seeking other people's opinions after that. I would say for languages like R and Python, there's enough usage in a community where the documentation is going to be really good for either language. And that's where I suggest starting, because at least then you learn it from the ground up, the way that the authors of the language have documented it. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing is once you pick up one language, it's easier to learn another language. And I do also suggest when you learn R or Python, go to what probably is an intermediate level. Don't just stop at like the beginner level, because you're going to need to go deep-ish.
Yeah, and there are a lot of really great books for Python that I'm aware of, I assume for R as well, that help to familiarize with the internals of the language. Mm-hmm. And so one really great book is Fluent Python. Love that book because it actually teaches you a lot of fundamental computing constructs, and it helps to prevent mistakes like using a list where you should be using a set, for example, because it teaches you what hash tables are and how that improves performance, and how if you just want something that you have to search through, then maybe a list is a low overhead construct to do that. So
there's two different threads too in learning a language, because you got to learn the language syntax and its operability, and you also need to learn how to apply it to solving your data problem.
Yep.
Right. So it's kind of two threads. When I approach learning a new language, I tend to actually go through probably at least half of the documentation for a language. I'm doing it with Swift right now, actually. And I found
just slightly insane, but I'm a big supporter of reading documentation.
It helps because I think because when you start getting into code, right, and you look at examples, it's there might be some things foreign to you. Right. Yeah. So, and Swift, I know, certainly does things a lot different than Python, like a lot different in many cases. And if you're not aware of that, you're going to try and approach it the way you think it should be done instead of the way it actually should be done. So, that's a good investment of your time. But then you also need to know how to solve your problem with that language. Yep. So, first bit of advice is definitely learn the tool, and then learn how to apply the tool to attacking your problem.
Yeah, and let me add on with what you're saying about reading documentation. There's a second reason why this is a really great idea, and that's that if I'm managing a software engineering or data science team and I'm looking to hire someone, reading documentation is actually a really vital skill, and it's a skill that a lot of people don't necessarily
Mhm.
have. And so, if while you're learning a language, you can also learn how to read programming language and framework documentation, then you're going to be a much better contributor to these teams, because that means that I can task you with solving a problem in some language and you can go research it. Research is not easy in software development, but it's actually, if you're working on stuff that's hard, it's going to consume a lot of your time. And so get good at it, get good at reading documentation,
Mhm.
basically.
And Stack Overflow isn't the same thing as reading documentation, by the way.
Right. It's not deep. It's often wrong, quite frankly.
Yeah. And maybe some other heuristics of, R or Python. I would say like R is definitely more suited for data analysis
Yeah.
and kind of EDA and that kind of thing. It's also just straight up, I think, way better at stats than Python.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's not to say somebody proficient in Python is not going to be, I think, as proficient as somebody in R, but I think starting out, you're just going to have a much easier time in R with those kind of things. Conversely, with machine learning, I mean, I've done both in, I've done machine learning in both languages. I think personally, Python is way better just because the libraries are more mature, the frameworks are more mature. sklearn, if you're doing classical ML, is about as good as you're going to get.
PyTorch,
PyTorch,
TensorFlow.
TensorFlow, yeah, it's like
Yeah.
I mean, it's all right there. So don't make it hard on yourself. And that's why I think we're of the opinion learn both because it's kind of,
Yeah.
again, these are kind of different tools. I know, the big debate is trying to equate the two and, and say, oh, one's better than the other. But I would say they're just different. And so
Yeah.
I almost think of it as more complementary than anything.
Yeah. And the nice thing about R too is that in data, you kind of have the SQL database paradigm, right? Where your data exists inside some table, remote machine, or remote service that you call. And then you have the data frame paradigm, which is similar, but the data frame paradigm really, I think R is the center of the data frame universe. And so if you can learn about data frames in R, then you can translate that into Python pandas, which is kind of the equivalent of a lot of the functionality in R. You can translate that into Spark, like you can translate it into a lot of different domains. And that's a very useful thing to do. It's like the notion of a liberal arts education, right? A liberal arts education, of course, you have a major, but it's also about becoming a well-rounded, educated person. And I think learning both Python and R makes you more rounded as a data person and prepares you to handle a lot of different challenges that you might not anticipate.
Mhm. Totally agree. I think it's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll keep coming across this topic on a weekly basis, like we have. Again, our intention is to just sort of settle the confusion from our viewpoint on which language you should choose. And at the end of the day, I don't think you can go wrong with either,
No.
honestly. But you got to start
Learn,
somewhere. So
yeah. Learn both and then figure out what you need to do in your job and focus on that.
yeah, right on. Well, cool. Well, we'll see you next Monday. So
All right.
all right,
Sounds
bye.
good.